Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? You know, it was just recently reported that Gennady Golovkin's opponent, or his possible opponent for April, which was the #1 mandatory, Toriano Johnson, is no longer available because he just suffered an injury. This is bad news, guys. This is bad news for Golovkin. Not only is it bad news for Golovkin, it's bad news for me personally because I wanted to see this fight. Don't get me wrong, of course I would rather see Golovkin in bigger fights, but I felt if we weren't going to get the unification bouts at the middleweight division against Billy Joe Saunders, Daniel Jacobs, I figured this would be a pretty good fight because of Toriano Johnson's style. Toriano Johnson almost has somewhat of a Marcos Maidana type style. Very aggressive, but he's a lot more skilled, and he's not as sloppy as a Marcos Maidana. Very strong, has a good chin, very aggressive. Unlike David Lemieux, he would not have been afraid to go on the inside and try to push Golovkin back. Very, very aggressive fighter. This would have been a very good test for Gennady Golovkin. Regardless of who we thought would have won, it would have been better than Golovkin versus Adama, Rubio, or someone like that. Even Monroe, just because of the fact Monroe had the skill, Monroe just didn't have the power. Toriano Johnson, he has the power. Lemieux had the power, but he didn't have the aggression. Toriano Johnson, he has the aggression, and he has some skill to go with that aggression. This kind of puts Golovkin in a situation where he is almost either forced to step up in competition and fight someone that he didn't want to fight, or he fights against another Adama or Willie Monroe. Now, according to the decafs who say they don't like fighters on a coincidental list like Deontay Wilder because he fights nothing but bums and etc., even though he's negotiating a fight with Alexander Povetkin, and he's trying to get a fight against Tyson Fury, the other heavyweight champion in the world. If Deontay Wilder is fighting opponents like that, what are you going to say if Golovkin's next opponent is a complete tomato can? Now, for those of you who will say, well, that's not fair because Gennady Golovkin, he has no one to fight. No one will fight him. That is untrue. He does have opponents that will fight him, and he does have worthy opponents that will fight him. There's a fighter that has been calling out Gennady Golovkin for the last year or so. He has an amateur pedigree. It could be argued that he beat Canelo Alvarez, and he's fought on pay-per-view before. He makes around the same amount of money that Golovkin makes. And he is Edis Landi Lara. Now, you guys seen the clip that I had at the beginning of this video. But if you want to watch that entire interview, go ahead and click on the little red box in the left-hand corner on the screen right now. And you can watch that entire interview of what Edis Landi Lara's manager, the Cubas, had to say about them fighting each other. Luis the Cubas, he basically said that we are willing, we can fight on HBO, that's not a problem. So you guys can't use the network excuses anymore. All right? So if there are no network excuses, Golovkin doesn't have a dance partner. He's not getting Canelo next. He's not going to be fighting Toriano Johnson. He's not going to move up to 168 and fight James DeGale. Billy Joe Saunders and Daniel Jacobs, they're not willing to fight Golovkin right now. So who can Golovkin fight next that would be bigger than an Edis Landi Lara fight? I know that is a very difficult question to answer, especially if you don't want to answer it correctly. And by the way, this is not to just suggest that Lara, he goes in there and just beats Gennady Golovkin. This is not about who we think is going to win, okay? Because I notice these Golovkin fans, they always like to say, oh, he'll beat Lara. Like almost saying there's no reason for him to fight Lara because he will beat him. But if that was the case, we would have never seen Golovkin versus Monroe, Adama, Marco Antonio Rubio, Gabe Rosado, David Lemieux, we would have never seen any of those fights. Because Golovkin going into those fights, he was the heavy favorite. So that doesn't make any sense. This is not about who we automatically think is going to win. This is about Golovkin getting better names on his resume. If Golovkin could be the first person to knock out Lara, do you know how impressive that would look? No one's ever knocked out Lara before. If he was to go in there and just dog walk Edeslani Lara, beat him to a pulp, no one's ever done that to Lara before. So fans, if Edeslani Lara's people, they have no problem fighting on HBO. They say that could be taken care of very easily. If Golovkin can fight Willie Monroe and all those other names that I mentioned, why wouldn't he fight Edeslani Lara? There is no way you guys can make sense of that. No way. It will be very, very interesting to see who Golovkin fights next. Because like I said, outside of Edeslani Lara, no other fight really makes sense. Unless Golovkin is going to challenge himself the way Adrian Broner did when he was at 135. And when fans were saying, oh, Broner is in a weak division and et cetera, there's nobody for him to fight. What did Broner do? Broner moved up all the way to 147. A weight he wasn't even comfortable at. And he fought bigger, stronger opponents. In Golovkin's case, he doesn't even have to move up 2 divisions. He already said he's willing to fight anyone from 154 to 175. So will he challenge himself the way Adrian Broner did? Will he challenge himself the way Sugar Shane Mosley did? When Shane Mosley was the undefeated lightweight champion, and he moved up not 1, but 2 weight classes to fight against top 3 best fighter in the world at the time, pound for pound, Oscar De La Hoya. If these smaller guys can do this, why can't Gennady Golovkin do this? It'll also be interesting to see what HBO does. Because as much as HBO loves Gennady Golovkin, there comes a time where even HBO, they're going to have to step in and say, hey, Golovkin, you're going to have to fight a better opponent than this. They did this with many fighters in the past. The fighter that comes to mind is Mikey Garcia. When Mikey Garcia was avoiding the Gamboa fight, Gamboa was aggressively calling him out. Even Bob Arum was ready to make that fight. Mikey Garcia, he didn't want the fight. Robert Garcia did not want the fight. So they tried to fight a softer type opponent, and you know what HBO did? HBO, they rejected the opponent. I think they rejected 2 opponents. I know they rejected 1 for sure. But HBO, they said, no, you're going to have to step up in competition, Mikey. And what did Mikey Garcia do? He tried to basically get out of his top-ranked contract instead of fighting Yuriorkis Gamboa. So it'll be very interesting to see what HBO does with Gennady Golovkin when it comes to accepting his opponents. Because, trust me, HBO, even though you hear writers and people try to say, 97,000 to 150,000 pay-per-views, those were great numbers. Even though you hear people saying that, behind closed doors, I can almost guarantee you that HBO is saying, this guy is not a pay-per-view star. He's not a pay-per-view star. He's not even the star that we thought that he was. Now, don't get me wrong. Golovkin, he could easily be that star, but the truth of the matter is he's going to have to start fighting fighters that are well-known, like an Edeslani Lara, like an Andre Ward, if he was able to, before Andre Ward moved up to 175. If he would have fought someone like that and he would have beat him, then he would have been a huge star. But we all know that he didn't have a good chance of beating an Andre Ward, and that's why another fight that would help propel Golovkin's star status is against James DeGale. Now, Golovkin said he was willing to go to the UK to Carl Froch's backyard and fight him. Why don't you go to James DeGale's backyard and fight him? But Team Golovkin, they already said they are not interested at all in fighting James DeGale. So, if Golovkin is not fighting Toriano Johnson, he's not unifying the titles next, he's not fighting against James DeGale. Once again, can you name any opponent that would be better than Edeslani Lara, considering they would have no problems negotiating that fight, according to Edeslani Lara's manager? So once again, before I wrap up this video, check out that entire interview that I did with Edeslani Lara's manager, Louis DeCubas. He said a lot of interesting things about Gennady Golovkin and a possible fight between them. So check that out. And that's all I got for now, and I'm on to the next one.